Okay, welcome everyone. We are going to be talking today about the horror genre and how it has been used through the years to indicate consequences for immorality, and how it's being used these days in different ways to communicate the same sort of messages and how we feel about it. So I'll be your moderator. My name is Laya V. I am a writer. I write noir and romance and mysteries and things like that. This is my book. And let's go ahead and introduce our panelists. Let's start with Courtney.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. My name is Courtney Alameda, and I am a YA horror author and a comic book writer. I've written a couple of these books that are behind me, nice big pictures. And I am currently hailing from Idaho, a middle of nowhere potato field that I love. So, hi.
All right. Kristy?
I'm Kristy S. Gilbert from Loose Leaf Editorial and Production. I'm a book editor and designer specializing in science fiction and fantasy, and I've been doing that for about 10 years.
Right. Excellent. Michaelbrent.
Michaelbrent Collings. I also am in Idaho, and I've been one of the top independent horror writers in the United States for a while, and I've written bestsellers. So here's some of my books. It's not all of them, and a couple of movies, and I've written in a lot of genres, but horror is like my home base. I like playing with that the most.
Right. Wait, hold up. Where in Idaho are you?
Meridian.
Oh, okay, cool.
And you?
Southeast, so Blackfoot, Pocatello area. Yeah.
And finally, Peter.
My name is Peter Orullian. I've written some epic fantasy for Tor. I've done a bunch of short fiction. I've done some horror. And the thing I've spent the past couple of years building out is a new urban fantasy series with Brandon Sanderson that we're co-authoring.
Cool.
So I just want to start by, kind of establishing what we're going to be talking about. How do we see horror works as being able to indicate the morality of the society that we're in, and to be able to guide morality within our society as a whole?
Sounds good.
I see it kind of functioning in two ways. Like, you see horror where the people who are bad are punished first. And whatever bad is gets, that varies from film to film or book to book. But I think you also see morality play into it as the thing that is the most horrifying is the thing that's the most amoral or immoral, depending. And I think both those elements come into play in different aspects of horror.
Yeah. We really saw a rise of this in the 80s, especially in the film industry with Halloween and a lot of these other films. Like, I remember growing up in the 80s and 90s as a child and being told not to play with Ouija boards, specifically because of The Exorcist. Like, my father was probably in his early 20s when The Exorcist came out, and very specifically has a memory of getting so sick during watching The Exorcist that he threw up on the lap of the woman next to him. And granted, he was probably drunk at the time. So we have a little bit of leeway for that. But like, that movie was so profoundly able to shape the American like thought processes and cultural what's the word I'm searching for? Just basically the cultural expectations for that item, that even in the 80s and 90s, kids were being told by their parents not to play with Ouija boards because they might be possessed. So that's some pretty potent and powerful storytelling there.
I think it's interesting that, you're talking about the 80s, and, before that, Dracula was a very much a watch out young women for sensual strangers, for foreigners. It's reflective a bit of the sensibilities, the nationalism of the time. And then we were talking about fairy tales beforehand. Kristy talked about it for a sec, that those were like the original morality and cautionary tales. I mean, Hansel and Gretel, don't wander off into the woods and eat crap that strangers gave it to you. I mean, it's the Middle Ages version of, like, if a man pulls up in a cargo van and offers you a Tootsie Roll, say no.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's really interesting how it's... Sorry, go ahead, Courtney.
No, you finish and then I'll add my comment.
I was just going to say, it's interesting how it flipped, because it was just morality. And in the 80s, I think we saw like the culmination of that, because it was very simple. Don't have sex, don't have drugs. There wasn't a lot of nuance. And now we have much more nuanced stuff, so that the villain can actually be the hero. And not just because he slays the evil people, but like Hannibal Lecter, he functions as the angel of death for God, because he's really a fallen angel who's out killing the truly bad people.
Right.
But we're now rooting for them, and they have a lot more. It's not just he's going to go after the person who has sex, but he's going to go after the person who violates cultural norms. You know, the person who doesn't play flute well in the orchestra, and plucks them out of obscurity, thinking they can just meander along doing poorly and not contributing. And he says no. So I think it's fascinating. We've gone from this very like binary, don't do this, do this, to this very nuanced, and the evil and the good is a lot more mixed up in everyone.
Yeah. And I don't want to talk too much. I want Peter to be able to say something, but I did want to add to Michaelbrent's point that storytelling in its most nascent form began, when people were still in Paleolithic eras, and saying, hey, don't eat those berries, or hey, that animal is dangerous. Like, so we're talking about like very primal things when we talk about morality and horror and this whole topic, essentially.
Yeah.
I find Brent's comment fascinating, because I never rooted for Lecter, or not. For Hannibal Lecter. I mean, he certainly serves some good in the story, but for me, the protagonist was always Starling, and the nuance came in that relationship, which was respectful but also super creepy. So the evolution of horror, I think, went from what was really in the 80s. It was such a popular genre that publishers were just falling over themselves to publish stuff. And so there was a lot of a dreck that kind of made it to the shelves. The interesting part of the question to me is the idea of some sort of community standard or socially sort of social perception of what is right and wrong, moral or immoral, to bounce against. Because it always, and this, so I'm building to something here, but it always made me wonder, like, in the absence of that, is horror even interesting? Like, if we did not have a larger, at least in this hemisphere, Judeo-Christian sensibility, or at least understanding and training, even outside those who are practiced religiously, would people even find horror interesting? And the same, by extrapolation, the same could be true in any society that has codified some sort of sense of what you should and shouldn't do. So I asked a friend of mine who's an award-winning writer who is just a devout atheist. I said, when you saw The Exorcist, did it scare you? And he said, yes. And I said, how's that possible? Because there's nothing in that belief system that should evoke any sort of emotion from you, because it's all hooey to you. And he said what happens, he believes, is that even those who remove themselves from standards of right and wrong or immorality or belief traditions will stipulate to those in the context of a story. But I think that there's still a precondition that says I have to understand what that is. And we still have at least some sort of cultural awareness of what right and wrong look like, even if we don't all believe the same about it.
I would think with like The Exorcist, you could almost extend that to body horror, with the loss of one's own ability to make one's own decisions and one's own, just autonomy, essentially. I mean, that's frightening in and of itself.
Yeah, and I don't understand that kind of fright. So there's probably a class of person that does. Like, for me, it was much more of the satanic shadings.
Yeah.
That did it for me, but.
I think it's worth noting that, like, morality is never universal within a culture. Even, we go back to the fairy tales, and fairy tales almost all have a very strong sense of justice. But if you stick them up next to each other, you don't really get a universal sense of morality. in this story, someone does something clever and they're rewarded. In this, they do something clever and the wolf eats them because they're a smart aleck. Like, within the story, there's that sense of justice or that sense of transgression. Like, and I think stories themselves can set up their own taboos that are internally consistent within the story. And if a viewer or reader, if you get buy-in from the reader, then even if that taboo doesn't relate to them, they can feel that sense of dread when that taboo is violated, even if it's not something they relate to. You know, you read a story about, you know, an Irish hero who's not supposed to eat a certain type of meat, and it has nothing to do with you, but when they are forced into a situation where they have to choose between two awful things, and one of them is eating that meat they're not supposed to eat, then you feel that sense of dread because they violated the taboo that the story has set up.
You know, that's really interesting that you say that, because sorry, I'm an author. I wake up late. I still have like morning mouth here. The culture of the story isn't necessarily universal, but I think good horror, the way it transcends that is partially, like, I agree, it sets up these limits within the story, and, you know, there's consequences to breaking them. But horror in particular, since it's meant to engender a physical response from the reader or the viewer, like we're supposed to have heart palpitations and get sweaty palms because we're so worried. I think part of what it does is it does force us to grapple with analogs within our life. And so, like, you know, The Exorcist is a great example. So even an atheist, any of us comes up against a situation beyond our control. One of the most terrifying moments in The Exorcist is when the daughter comes down and just pees herself in the middle of a really important dinner party. And certainly all of us worry about, you know, my kids. What if there's a developmental problem with my kid? The most unnerving part of The Exorcist is when they stick the needle in her neck and just a little so they can do the MRI or whatever it is, the CAT scan, and a little bit of blood squirts out. And that's so representative. It's not just about, am I going to call a Catholic priest, but who do I call when my family falls apart? Right. Who do I call when I am worried about losing my job? And horror can grapple with these very sort of here and now, temporal, worldly issues. And then for those who want to, and this is where I'm fascinated the most, is it broadens it into that question of, if there's a devil and you call a priest, there's a God. And how do you move beyond that? So, like, it can be used in a very microcosmic sort of way, or move out to these big metaphysical questions according to the reader.
Yeah. And I think that's why horror is so successful when the world is kind of in the toilets, is because horror teaches us that these things are surmountable, that we can face these demons and these monsters or whatever else is out there that's frightening us and overcome them.
My favorite distillation of horror, unsurprisingly, is from Stephen King, of whom I'm a big fan. And he said once that horror fiction is just a rehearsal for death.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It allows us to think about death, talk about death in a safe space, essentially.
Go ahead. I think we've said this before on horror panels, but I think it bears repeating. And it's certainly debatable, but of all of the genres of fiction, at least to my mind, horror is the most moral.
Yeah.
I think it is the one that most, even though we talk about the nuances, I think it is the one that most clearly delineates who you cheer for. And I know that there's huge movements in fiction to create, moral ambiguity and all of this. And I think there's some interest there. But I think readers, even though they want complication and they want to know, failings and flaws, I think it's one of the genres of fictions that remains, that allows you to pretty clearly know who to cheer for in terms of moral certitude.
And even with the moral ambiguity, like, that's not horror. The horror isn't the fact that the person has this moral question or this failing. It's the moment when they cross the line. I mean, there can't be horror without a recognized standard of this is the way it should be. Because horror is this hope for what is or what can be taken away or threatened to be torn away. And so to have horror without morality is impossible, I think, on some levels. Like fantasy, you can just go, oh, look at the world building. Dune, science fiction. And I don't remember a whole lot of the science fiction other than the planet being such a fantastic character. But horror, you get down into this is the world as it should be. And here's the monster that's making it impossible.
Yeah.
Do you think that also works the other way, where you have like the world becomes kind of the horror element? It's the world as it should not be. And then you have the character that's fighting against that.
Yeah, that's zombie fiction.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking a little bit about Annihilation in terms of this panel. If you've seen that film, where there's this, I don't really want to spoil it. How do you talk about this film without spoiling it? But, they're sending teams into this world that's, their world is changing and they're trying to figure out what's going on, and the scientists are being sent in and all the scientists are dying. And I think that very much so fits the bill for this. So, yeah.
And that's a big problem today, because we don't die of smallpox anymore.
Right.
And I think that's part of why body horror is kind of a niche thing. It's a thing that people worry about, but there's a lot less concern that I'm going to die in childbirth, or, I'm going to get to the ripe old age of 29, develop gout and die.
Right.
But there's a lot of concern of even me, I'm a fairly successful writer. There's a lot of you guys are awesome, but there's nothing to stop your publishing company or Amazon from just saying, we're killing your career.
Right.
And we couldn't stop it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Do you see a divide in horror between like a cautionary tale and a morality tale? Are those the same thing, or do you think there's a difference between them?
I think there's definitely a difference. Like a cautionary tale goes out to say, if you talk to strangers, you die.
If you have sex in this field, you'll die.
You'll die. Like it goes out with a specific line that you should not cross, or consequence X. Like do X, you will receive Y. That feels more like a cautionary tale to me. A morality tale seems more like the sort of thing that's going to give you ideals. And even if and so it's more aspirational, whereas cautionary tale is more like, this is where we stop the activity. Like anything up to this line, stop. Over there is bad. I think morality tales try to drive more of seeing what is good rather than pointing out what is bad.
Sort of like the selflessness in Train to Busan, essentially, where don't you love that film?
I love and Peninsula sucked.
I know, right? But the idea that the humanistic idea that people are good and that we should be working to eliminate human suffering and things like that. And I think a lot of these kinds of humanistic tales are starting to pop up in horror because we're grappling with these ideas, not just in the Western world, but I think all over the world. We're trying to decide, how responsible are we to eliminate human suffering worldwide? I think the pandemic has really thrown this, into like sharp relief. Like, how responsible are we to reach out and help other countries? How responsible are we for global warming and climate change? Like, these things are constantly at the forefront of our minds right now. And I think that's why we're seeing so much horror focused on human responsibility and what we owe to one another.
So some of it, this isn't meant to be a contentious statement. Good friend. but
you all suck.
Back on the glamorous Draculas. To me, a lot of the more current horror, though, seems to be the way that it's creating its dread, the way it's evincing its emotion is by waving the banner of nihilism. I don't find that kind of fiction very interesting.
Either way.
And I think that leans a little bit more into the cautionary versus the morality. And so if I were going to make a distinction with my reading time, I'd far rather read horror of the morality tale brand, where there's more clearly a right way. Is going to be awful getting there. People are going to suffer, but at the end we can take some relief and some edification from some sort of triumph in the interest of humans.
Right.
The other way is, let the world burn, and that's just scary. So when you're done, for me anyway, I feel it's like a seventh chord that doesn't resolve. It's just really unsatisfying, and I know that that's an intentional thing, and some writers will do that. But that feels to me like it feels to me like a gimmick. Like I'm intentionally going to make sure that at the end of the story, you're not resolved, and you just feel like everything's going to hell in a handbasket.
Yeah.
Nice day. And there's too many books to read for me to read those ones.
You want your nihilism to go one step further. Nothing matters, so we have to make it matter ourselves.
Yeah.
Rather than like nothing matters, so it should all burn.
I like what both. Yeah, right. I like what both of you said. I think the morality is interesting. Those are the enduring ones, and the cautionary tales, when they are utilized, they're a one-off. And if you try and reproduce those, they become about the gimmick. And we've actually been talking about it already. Like 30 years later, we're still talking about, look, don't have unprotected, literally, sex. They're totally unprotected. They're in a field with a crazy person. And we're still talking about that.
Or you're going to get a supernatural STD that just follows you everywhere you go. That's going to kill you.
But those are impactful, and people are still talking about it. If you look at, like, Saw, which I think actually the first one was a morality play, and it was about choices and appreciation of life. But when they tried to reproduce the cautionary aspect, no one remembers anything about movies 2 through 19 or whatever they're up to, other than the gimmick. Remember that one time Jigsaw pulled everyone's faces off at once? And the cautionary tales, they're for a specific moment in a specific time, and generally to a specific audience is where they are effective. Whereas the cautionary tales, I mean, kids today, you talk to them about the original Halloween, and a lot of them, all of them that are into horror almost, they're like, yeah, I've seen it and here's my thoughts. Because it's not just a cautionary tale, it's talking about the deeper moralities of the time, and those can be applied further. So just aside from the fact that I don't like to be kicked in the gutter and then left there at the end of the story, I think the ones that show us redemption as a possibility, if not an actuality, those are the ones that generations glom onto. And even Stephen King, like, people rarely talk about his current work. You talk about his best stuff and it's always 30 years ago, because he had a much more clear-cut morality in them. He had a much more clear-cut good and bad. And now I have to stop reading a lot of his books just because, like, I can't spend that much time with such radically stupid and nasty people.
Well, and I think the line between cautionary tale and morality tale can be thin, or it can just be a matter of how far you take the story. Like, Babadook can be like, if you stop it too early, then it can just be a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
But if you extend it to the full resolve, then it can become a morality tale with that, where you get that full resolve. And so sometimes I think it's just a matter of how far you push the story, whether you stop at cautionary or go to morality.
You're setting something within a greater framework, like, and that those matter more. It's like, if I tell you, my car didn't start today, that's a bummer and you'll feel for me a little. But then if I add, and I didn't make it to my grandma's side before she died, now you've got this much greater framework that I've put this individual story into. And so, yeah, I think when you don't have to necessarily, like, say, and here's what happened to everybody in the end, but you have to show them that they exist in this framework where the story, even if the author doesn't spell it out, will continue to a logical conclusion that you, the audience, can figure out and mull over and apply to your universe.
which kinds of morality tales or ethical issues do you think are best suited to the horror genre?
All of them.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything that's off limits, to be honest.
I don't think so either.
My only edit on that would be, I don't think there's anything that should be off limits. There are certainly forces trying to tell us that there are certain things we shouldn't write about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the key is doing it responsibly. Like one of my least favorite things, and I apologize if I offend anybody, but people say, do you ever worry about what the audience wants? And they say, I go where my art takes me. I'm like, that's the definition of a sociopath. I mean, that's somebody who's just doing whatever they want without thinking about its effect on others. You know, it's like my gratification. I'm following my muse, and screw you. And I think that that's the key to horror, really, is we're constantly aware of effect on audience when we're doing horror at its best. And that is applicable to everything, you know, no matter if it's a small problem, I'm losing contact with my kid, that is small, it only is for me, or how do we deal with the facelessness of modern life, you know? And so horror can handle all of that stuff, and nothing is off limits, like Peter said, but I think as we get to the edges of those limits, it behooves us as creators to be careful what we're trying to do.
I think you have to. I think you definitely have to be cognizant of the ways in which, you know, narrative choices will delimit the audience. You know, and that's a function of storycraft. It's also a function of social pressures that are definitely, you know, making themselves heard in the interest of the publishing establishment. Independent writers have less sort of oversight on, so, but they'll still need to exercise those choices. And I would be loath to be the person to tell them what they should do, but it does behoove them to understand that those choices may have consequences.
Right.
Yeah.
And you know, I know I'm kind of speaking cryptically, but it's important that the writer understand that even if done well, even if done really well, there are ways that people can take exception, and horror opens itself up a little bit to this more than others, because, and that's what this whole conversation about is, it does purport to have some morality, even if it's just the internal consistency of morality inside the story. And while that's powerful stuff, it's also something easy for readers to object to. Let's leave it at that.
Yeah.
Well, and also there's the objection: how can you try and teach me morality when you have all this blood and guts in the show or in the book, or, you know, you get that. It's like, how can you delve into that? And I think that's a huge error that people are making now. Our society is like, everything has to be safe. Everything, trigger warning, and you can't offend me, even if we've never sat down and discussed the things that offend me. And because of that, horror, which explicitly says, I'm going to make you uncomfortable, makes some people lash out and go, well, if your goal is to make me better, how can you do that by hurting me? And it kind of invalidates an important part of the life experience.
100% agree.
I think some of that boils down to just audience preparedness, though. Like,
yeah.
If it's labeled as horror and everyone knows it's horror, then if you go into it and you're horrified, I feel like you got what you came for.
Yeah. That's kind of what you signed up for.
Yeah, right.
I've gotten 1-star reviews on Amazon that were like, it was so scary. What's wrong with this person? I'm like,
it's like when people review middle grade books and they're like, this was written for a 12-year-old. You're like, yeah, it was. Good eye.
Yeah. Thanks, Captain Obvious. That's really helpful.
Thanks for being belittling about it, but
I post those 1-star reviews, by the way. I share them with everybody.
I think it's kind of a challenging area, because a lot of the the really great fiction anymore isn't so sort of staunchly inside a genre. I mean, many of the best books that sort of transcend the genre use elements of horror. So someone may not be approaching a book that's just listed as a novel. One of my favorite writers is Dan Simmons, and he hasn't been classified as a horror writer for a long time. But there's rarely a book of his that doesn't have horrific elements. So in some ways, horror can also just be a technique and not just an entire sort of narrative motion. But in that case, you still are going to have the person who comes up against something that's uncomfortable. And, I hate to sound like a cheerleader, but in some regards, I wonder if horror writers are at the sort of the vanguard of writers who are saying discomfort is healthy. Like having your ideas challenged is healthy. If the only voices you're listening to are the voices exactly like you, then you're a very sort of one-dimensional like reader or whatever. And so horror, if you're going to write horror, I think you sort of assume this mantle that you're going to be the person that creates trigger warnings, and that's part and parcel of the craft.
Yeah, I agree.
I think that's a really good.
Oh, go ahead.
I think that's a really good point that horror, by its very nature, has the ability to kind of shock you out of your comfort zone and put you into a place where it can be easier to hear some of the messages coming through in the story than it might be in another genre where you're just allowed to sit there in your happy little comfort zone where you don't have to think about something that might make you unhappy or upset.
That said, I do think it's good when people can at least decide if that's a discomfort they're willing to accept. Like, for example, I startle super easily. Like, it's ridiculous. I don't scare easily, but I startle very easily to the point where, like, I will get, like, when I got pregnant, I had to stop playing Skyrim because the spiders would jump out at me and I'd throw up because I was, like, already nauseous. And then I jump scare. And so
do like, not get the giant spider mod then. Like
like before I watch a horror movie, I have to talk to someone who's seen it before and ask, like, are there lots of jump scares? Because if there are, it's not something I'm going to be able to enjoy because I'm going to spend most of the time sick to my stomach because like even when I know they're coming, I can hear it in the music. I know it's there. People don't just jump scare out of nowhere. Like I can hear it coming in the music. I can see it in the lighting. Doesn't matter that I know it's coming. It's still going to make me startle. I'm still going to get sick to my stomach. It ruins the experience for me. So like I can enjoy horror, but I screen my horror movies I'm very strict about what I take in because I can't enjoy it without knowing how often it's going to make me fall off the couch.
As I've gotten older and got better informed about some of the atrocities that have happened in the world, I can no longer watch torture porn. I can't watch anything that is excessively gory. I can still watch slashers and, people getting shot and stabbed and all that kind of stuff. But anything where, the pain is stretched out and intentionally inflicted is just too much for me to bear these days. And actually, I've currently working on a novel that is about the beginnings of torture porn in France during the Belle Epoque. And in France, this theater was called the Grand Guignol, and it actually had this huge run from I want to say 1885 all the way to the end of World War II. And the theater itself went into decline after people saw what happened in the concentration camps and realized, oh, this isn't just fun anymore. There are terrible things out there happening to people, and we can't stomach it anymore. So I feel like the people in Paris after World War II, I can no longer deal with some of the more explicit, torturous elements of this genre.
And that's okay. My kids, I have one of them who kind of likes horror, and the rest are just not interested. Well, two of them are too young, and I'm not going to let them because I do think, look, you give people what they're ready for. Yeah. I don't let my kids who are 5 and 3, and this is just me, I'm not judging other people, but I'm not going to let them watch a horror movie because I'm going to be inflicting something so far outside their experience. They're not going to have a framework for understanding it. And rather than educating them, it's going to scar them.
Yeah.
And if they never turn out liking horror, that's fine. And one of the big problems with when we talk about genre is the danger of becoming, rather than a welcoming opportunity, we become a cult where it's like you have to like this to get into literary heaven, which is just bullcrap. Or, if you don't like the most recent Fault in Our Stars kind of movie, you have no heart. Baloney. It's for different people. It's for different times. And some people like everything, and great. But the reality is horror is not for everybody necessarily. I think horrific elements belong in every story.
Because life is horrific.
Story. It makes it matter.
500,000 Americans are dead, So, I mean, life is horrific.
It makes it matter.
Yeah.
Nobody has ever bought a book called Village of the Shiny Happy People where everybody was shiny happy and nobody ever had a bad day. I mean, the cover finishes the book.
I might buy that book to see when it lied. Like, that sounds like a cover that's lying to me, and I want to know how it's lying.
Right? But you need that element of horror, but just a book that focuses, didactically on that teaching method, if you want to say, look, people don't have to like that. Some people like lecture courses and some people like Socratic method. It doesn't make one bad and one good. It makes the students different.
I wanted to ask if you can give any examples of movie. You've given a few, but any examples of movies or books that you think really tackle this morality tale really well?
The Stand.
Yeah.
Up to and including at the end. Spoiler, I'm sorry, you can't talk about the morality of it with it a bit. Stephen King breaks the survivors of Captain Trips, the super flu, which is, The Stand has been doing gangbusters business during the Contagion. But he breaks them up into two explicitly good and evil camps. And interestingly, the life experience is better in the evil camp. They have electricity earlier, they have all the good stuff, but they're broken up into these two different leaderships. One of them is following a prophetess. She literally talks to God, and one of them is following the devil. And at the end, Stephen King saves the day with, quote, the finger of God. You can't get much more kind of epically moral than the story he's telling. And it's a wonderful story. It's the unabridged version is like 1,000 pages and it's fantastic.
Yeah.
There's my probably second favorite Stephen King film is Hearts in Atlantis. And it's it didn't do well with the critics who just call it a mood piece, which I find infuriating. But it's also a morality tale, and it sets up this moral quandary between the use of natural gifts in service of a government that would abuse them, and someone who just really wants to live their life. And while that's sort of the MacGuffin that's always present in narrative, you get this beauty of living a life for its own sake, and being able to have that experience with all of the problems and loss of love and the pain of memory, and the relationship between the two main characters. And it's a more nuanced morality tale, but it's a clear morality tale, but it's told in a different way. It's told in a quieter way that is, I think, just so beautiful.
I'll elaborate on mentioning Babadook earlier. Like, Babadook is about the morality of grief, like both the moral responsibility to deal with grief for the purposes of the community around you and for yourself. Like, and it it's not the sort of tale where it's like, oh, if you do this, grief goes away. Yay. Like you're not sad anymore. But it's a metaphor, an extended metaphor about the responsibilities of grief.
I would argue that Midsummer probably does something very similar to that. I don't know how many of you have seen Midsummer, but it is about a young woman who has lost her entire family in a very tragic suicide murder, and goes off with a not exactly a doting boyfriend to some Norwegian, Scandinavian summer ritual, and things just go horrifically wrong. And so that was I don't want to spoil that one because that one was just really, really wonderful. And what was really amazing about that film in particular is there's only one shot taken at night for the entire film. Like it was entirely shot during the daytime and just absolutely just horrifying. So I'd really recommend that one. And then I have to give a shout out to Cabin in the Woods for taking every 80s trope, well, maybe not every, but most of the 80s tropes in horror, and then just shattering them gleefully as it went along. That one's a really fun one as well.
You know, can I point out on Cabin in the Woods, though, and I'm not saying like don't enjoy it because like it's super fun, but I find it interesting. As far as this morality play that we've been talking about, the ending sucks. I mean, it is just a kind of a bummer, downer.
Agree.
Nothing mattered. It's fine within the movie,
but that's the point.
But it is. I think so too. But most of the people, like you, when we talk about Cabin in the Woods, the first thing they say is, and it had so much fun with the 80s tropes. They don't talk about the morality of it or even how scary it was, because really at its heart that's a dark comedy more than anything.
Absolutely.
So I think it's funny.
It's a horror movie about horror movies.
I'll probably have a lot of people disagree with me, but I never really liked Stranger Things.
I agree with you.
I found that it traded so hard on, inside baseball with Stephen King fans and a bunch of the 80s sort of nostalgia that I was never participatory in. I never had any horrific reaction. And because I lived through the 80s, I felt like it was like glad handing the whole time. And so many people just hold that up as such a bright, shining example. And I can't see it. And I admit I have some biases because I'm a huge Stephen King fan and I'm a child of the 80s, but I just thought that fell 100% flat.
I actually, now that I think about it, don't know if I know too many horror buffs who have really liked Stranger Things. I find that people who generally gravitate towards other genres have really liked Stranger Things, but I don't know if I can name any of my horror writing friends who've been really enamored of it.
Yeah.
Well, we have a little time for questions from the audience if there are any.
Absolutely. We have Shinmegumi asks, what types of horror are more targeted towards morality than cautionary tales?
All of mine. Because it fascinates me. No, and it's not a plug. There's tons of them, but like I'm fascinated by those questions. And one of the neat things about horror is it says it's survivable, because even if everybody dies because they fail in the morality, you get to close the book. You read the end and continue. And that makes the most powerful horror is this, at the end of it, you're like, well, I've survived and I can go out to my day and survive the next thing.
Yeah, it's catharsis.
Yeah.
There are, I don't know if this is what the question is trying to drive at, but there are sort of subgenres inside the larger horror umbrella. And there's a murder porn category. There's sort of a splatter punk, it's just about, a lot of killing. So there are some of these subgenres, and I would agree that some of those do morality stories less well. So but the thing is if you go into your local bookstore, it's not like the 80s where you might get this sub-branding. So you're going to have to either get recommendations, or you're going to have to sort of ask ask your bookseller to try and get at, what sort of approach it's taking. So you can get at books like Michael's that, are doing it better.
And don't look at Amazon, by the way. Well, look at it. It's horrifying. Go to the horror bestsellers on Kindle, because self-published authors get to pick their categories. And so a lot of people are like, I want to be on any bestseller category. Fully half of the horror books, they are humorous erotica. And that's
really?
Because it is a very competitive market.
Is that like the Bigfoot and dinosaur books?
No, those are just hilarious. Those are awesome. The Chuck Tingle ones, those are ridiculous.
No, not just Chuck Tingle, but like I know there's some woman who made like $500,000 on Bigfoot erotica or something like that.
And it's like you look at the horror page and it's all huge boobed, almost naked women. And in the background there's like a pack of wolves, and stuff like that. It is completely not horror, but they just want to be able to say I'm a bestseller, and they can't break into the actual erotica because it's too competitive. So you really do.
I still think I'm in the wrong field.
Oh, you have to be discriminating. Peter's totally right.
Yeah, Amazon is the last place to look for any guidance on books to buy.
Yeah. Agreed.
We can take another question, I think.
Okay. Swaith asks, to what extent does horror have to actually be scary? Are stories that are unsettling and dread-provoking but not necessarily scary, not in any way, not just jump scare ways, horror?
I think so. Horror was always defined to me as a genre that should leave you with a lingering sense of dread. And so I don't necessarily think that always means you need to have jump scares and gore. I think a book like Dracula, we mentioned Dracula earlier, is horrifying in ways that something like Cabin in the Woods or The Exorcist is not. It leaves you with that lingering sense of unease.
I've gotten that from the Dan Simmons books that I've read, that lingering sense of dread. And that's like, if he didn't have so much science fiction packed in there, he would definitely be billed as horror.
I think some of my favorite horror stories are actually those ones that don't give you that fright, but they leave you with that sense of dread at the end, like The Yellow Wallpaper.
Oh yeah.
That one just it sits on your heart for the rest of your life after you read it, and that feeling, can be some of the most powerful horror, in my opinion.
You do have to have that wrongness. You can't have horror without the unsettling. You don't have to maybe shriek, but there should be a point even if it's after the reading moment where you're thinking about it, where you go, no, that can't be. Or that is one of the defining characteristics of horror, because if you don't have the wrongness, you're reading The Notebook.
True horror, that. Stephen, I feel like I just keep regurgitating Stephen King, but he said once, and I may misquote this, but the sort of highest form of horror is dread, and that's the thing always to shoot for. Just below that is the scare, which can come in different ways, but to scare your audience, and the last is the gross out. And he's quick to point out that he's not above the gross out. That's not where he's always aiming. He's aiming for dread.
Yeah. I remember watching The Outsider, and I think the most afraid I have been in ages is watching The Outsider. I don't know how many of you have seen the HBO show, where a shapeshifter is starting to kill children in a small neighborhood. And you don't really see a lot of gore. There aren't a lot of jump scares, but it's just it's this community trying to find this monster or trying to figure out what's happening. Just left me with so much dread, and so as I was watching the show, I got so wound up emotionally. So that was really, really well done, at least until the last 2 episodes. But the first 8 were excellent. I did not stick the landing on that one, unfortunately. It was very tragic.
That also feeds into the idea that the monster is always scarier before you actually see it.
Absolutely.
Yep. Horror has trouble sticking the landing in general.
I agree.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it does, because it's so much about the the unknown is one of the most terrifying things that there is. And once it becomes known, there's something that's taken away from it.
So there's an interesting example that comes to my mind that for me kind of runs counter to some of this wisdom. And it's the scene, and by the way, Michael, this is the scene that I used as my defense against glittering vampires in our other thing. But there's a scene in Dracula where, Dracula arrives and he's been out looking for food for his little minions. And you know who he is. He's a vampire, so he's scary. But what he does is he's got a gunny sack of babies that he throws over for them to feed on. Mm-hmm. And you don't see the babies. All that's described is the babies moving inside the gunny sack. I remember that more than I remember any vampire attack.
Oh, yeah.
In any book. And I knew exactly who he was. He wasn't sticking his incisors in a neck. He was throwing a gunny sack of babies for people to eat. But it was so much more nuanced in how he, I'm trying to get shock value out of it. But that's one of
Any sack of babies is going to be trending on Twitter today.
For sure.
But that's an example that kind of works across all three of those categories.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I mean,
totally.
It does all of those things.
Unfortunately, we are out of time.
Hashtag gunny sack of babies.
Hashtag gunny sack of babies.
We will leave you with a lovely thought. So thank you, everybody. This was very enlightening.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Buy the books.